Hello, and welcome back to Felony Spectator. I am your host, Heather. On today's episode, we're talking about the tragic death of Cooper Harris, who was a 22-month-old baby. Cooper was left in the car by his father, Justin Ross Harris, on a hot day while he went to work. The reason why I chose this case, because it goes a lot deeper than just a parent forgetting their child. Justin Ross Harris claims he just simply forgot, but he ended up with a 32-year sentence behind bars, and police uncovered a whole lot more about who Ross truly was. There is a phenomenon that occurs with parents that is so common that it actually has a name. It's called forgotten baby syndrome. And forgotten baby syndrome affects parents all over the world. On an average, over 38 kids die in unoccupied vehicles every year in the United States. But the last 2 years, it's reached upwards of 50 kids per year. Experts believe it's as simple as a temporary memory lapse, usually caused from stress and your brain just going into autopilot. That brings us to the tragic death of Cooper Harris. Cooper was born to Justin Ross Harris, who goes by the name Ross Harris, and Leanna Harris. Ross is originally from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and the graduate of the University of Alabama. Ross worked as a 911 operator while in Alabama, but moved to Marietta, Georgia in 2012 to work as a web developer for Home Depot. He would be a regular at church and a lead guitarist in a church band. And on the surface, it sounds like he's just a really wholesome guy. Leanne Harris, who now goes by her maiden name Leanne Taylor, was a dietitian who married Ross in 2014 after being set up on a blind date. They would marry 2 years later, and they wanted to have children right away, but they had trouble conceiving, so it would take another 8 years before they finally had their miracle baby, Cooper. Leanna would say that Ross loved his little Cooper with all his heart and was a wonderful father. She would also say that their parenting style was very equal. So she wasn't the kind of mom who did everything. They shared their duties, so it was often Ross who fed Cooper or Ross that got him dressed, changed his diapers. To her, Ross seemed like he was a really good father and very proud. Cooper was said to be a very outgoing, happy child. He wasn't afraid to talk to strangers, and he liked to wave at everyone and say hi. And Ross was very outgoing as well, so he often talked to the strangers who gushed over his son. And Cooper was a little cutie. It's not surprising at all that strangers would want to stop and chit-chat. Ross and Cooper would have the morning together on June 18th, 2014. Leanna had to go to work first, so Ross would be in charge of dropping Cooper off to daycare before heading to work himself. Now, this wasn't something that was unusual. In fact, Ross often had to be in charge of Cooper in the mornings because Leanna's work schedule. She often worked earlier than Ross, so he would be the one to drop him off. That morning, Leanna would leave for work around 7 a.m., and Ross would get Cooper ready for the day. Before taking Cooper to daycare, they would stop at a Chick-fil-A at 8:45 for breakfast and enter the restaurant together. Ross would be seen holding Cooper in his arms, and they were both seemingly happy and friendly, saying hi to all the restaurant staff. Ross was also introducing Cooper to the restaurant manager, and Cooper was said to be wide awake and giggling. After breakfast, Ross would buckle Cooper in his rear-facing car seat and give him a kiss, then walk to the driver's side of the car and get in. Now, at this point, Ross should have driven Cooper to daycare, but instead, he only drove a half a mile up the road to the Home Depot office where he worked. Ross would be seen on camera backing into a parking spot under a tree, getting out of his vehicle and going into the building without Cooper. The daycare didn't get a call from Leanna or Ross that Cooper was going to be absent that day. Normally, if Cooper was sick, either Ross or Leanna would call them to let them know, but on that day, they didn't. It's not a requirement for parents to call in sick for their kids, more of a courtesy, so they're not required to follow up with the parents if a child is away. Ross also didn't send Leanna any updates about Cooper either. Ross is known to send Leanna lots of photos of Cooper throughout the day. In fact, Ross used to always take photos of Cooper at daycare drop-off and would send them to Leanna. But a few months previously, Leanna said it wasn't necessary to do anymore because Cooper would just run inside and start playing. And I guess it wasn't always easy to take a photo of him, so she told Ross not to worry about it anymore. Ross would stay in the office until around 12:30 p.m. before heading out for lunch with two friends. One of the friends would pick him up just outside the front door of the office, and they'd go to a nearby Publix. After lunch, Ross asked them if they could stop to purchase some light bulbs, which they did, and then his friends dropped him off not far from his vehicle. And Ross would then walk over to his Hyundai Tucson, open the driver's side door, and toss the light bulbs inside. And you can't really see in the CCTV video what direction Ross is looking, but he would later claim not to have looked at anything other than the driver's seat area of the car. And then he just went back to work. So Ross would go to work until about 3:16, and then he'd send a text message to Leanna asking when she was going to pick up his little buddy. Leanna would also say around 4 p.m. they spoke on the phone, and Ross told Leanna that he was going to go to a movie right after work and that he wasn't going to go home first. Now, despite talking about Cooper, none of their conversations or text triggered a memory for Ross that he never actually went to the daycare that morning. I cannot relate to that because I am an overthinker. I know everyone's brains work differently, but for myself personally, if I was asking my husband when he was picking up our child, I'd be thinking about him or remembering about my child, and probably would have remembered something like, oh, when I dropped off Cooper, he went straight to the books, or something like that. And if I didn't have that recollection of dropping off my child, it absolutely would put me in panic mode. But for Ross, he still had no idea. When Leanna went to the daycare to pick up Cooper, she would learn that Cooper wasn't actually dropped off that morning. Other than being slightly confused to learn the news, she remained relatively calm. She was a pretty calm person normally, but some would question her reaction. And she actually said to the daycare workers, quote, "Ross must have left him in the car. There's no other explanation," end quote. And it must have just felt like a punch in the gut. I couldn't imagine what that would feel like. And this was also a fear of hers, that one day Cooper would be forgotten and left in the car. She would say she thought it was just an irrational fear because she also trusted Ross and couldn't imagine that it would actually happen. But that raises some questions as to why she was so calm in that moment then. She would try and phone Ross to inquire about where Cooper was, but he wasn't answering his phone, so she'd leave the daycare and go to Ross's office to speak with him in person. And from what I know, she didn't try and find his car in the parking lot first. Instead, she just went straight inside to speak with him. Leanna would continue to call him, but on the witness stand, she would say things got a bit fuzzy and she started to forget things. She did say that she was in the lobby of the office with the TV on, and people were just all standing around watching something on the news. And there was a report of someone local who left their baby in a car. Leanna's phone would then ring, and the detective would tell her to stay put and someone was going to come get her. It's unclear, but I believe someone in the office pointed out that they thought it was Ross's car while she was still in the lobby. But like I said, her memory of events are now fuzzy. Ross had left the office at around 4:15 and was apparently driving towards the movie theater to see 22 Jump Street with the same friends he met for lunch, and he would drive for a few minutes before noticing Cooper's lifeless body still in the car seat. He pulled over into the parking lot of Mateo Restaurant and would scream out for help. Bystanders would say that he constantly was saying, "What have I done? What have I done?" And, "Oh my God, my son is dead. Oh my God." A bystander would be the one to call 911, and someone else would also try and resuscitate Cooper. Detectives would later say that when they arrived, Ross was pacing around, talking on his phone, and it's unclear who he was talking to. Ross said that he called the daycare 2 times, and I'm not sure why, maybe to see if Leanna was there, and 1 call to his wife, but he didn't leave any messages for anyone. Police testified that they heard him talking on the phone, but Ross claims that he didn't actually reach anyone. While he was pacing around, police asked him 2 times to get off the phone, and he refused both times. And then he would get angry and use profanities towards the officers. So they detained him.
When they arrived, someone else was doing CPR to Cooper. He was talking on the phone to somebody. Officer came up, he yelled at her.
What? Hold on. Hold on, my son died.
And while on the back of the police cruiser, he would go into a manic state from dramatically crying and then looking completely calm and sort of looking around him. And temperatures that day had reached upwards of 88 degrees, which means that Cooper didn't stand a chance after being left in the car for 7 hours. He passed away from hyperthermia. Hyperthermia is when you're really hot, and hypothermia is when you're really cold. Paramedics would say that Cooper had been dead for some time. Rigor mortis had already set in, as well as lividity, and that's when your blood settles and it actually makes an impression on your skin. A police officer on scene would testify later that the car had a sweaty, sweet smell to it inside, as well as urine, similar to what he's experienced at other death scenes before. And he would also discuss the smell with other detectives on scene. And apparently this is a really unique odor that is from the gases the body gives off after death. But Ross doesn't recall the car having any smell. Leanna would finally make it to the police station, and detectives broke the news to her. Strangely, her response wasn't sadness here at all. She wasn't angry, she seemed really neutral, and she also didn't ask to see her son or ask where her son was.
Your child is deceased. I'm very sorry to have to tell you that.
Where's my husband?
Your husband is up at our headquarters right now. I am going to have to go over a few things with you. Just pretty much about the day and everything. Has he contacted you already?
I talked to him at 4.
Okay. And what did he tell you at 4?
That he was going to a movie with some friends and that I was going to pick up Cooper from daycare.
Okay. And that's the last time you've talked to him?
Yes.
He hasn't called you since then?
I've been trying to call him. He
Okay.
tried to call me once, but it went...
She even got a phone call and broke the news to someone else who became very upset, and she was still very calm. Now, before the police interviewed Ross, he was still in a very manic state of screaming to being calm, sipping water, and pacing the room, similar to how he was in the back of the police car. However, when investigators came in to question Ross, he was very calm, and even when they offered their condolences, he didn't even shed a tear. He simply tells investigators matter-of-factly that after breakfast, he strapped Cooper in the car seat, kissed him, and went to work instead of daycare. And he would continue answering their questions and was just really neutral in answering.
Just kind of, his eyes were open like halfway. His eyes were open halfway. He wasn't breathing. He didn't have a pulse. And every medic training I've ever gone through, told me to check for breathing, check for a pulse. He didn't have either. I knew it. I knew that I had done what every parent in their life fears they've done, and that's just leave their son in the car all day. And
he was even really relaxed while they were discussing sentencing and charges. I will link that conversation below because it's kind of long, but you'll see how normal he's behaving, almost like he's discussing getting a raise, not going to prison. He claims that Cooper falls asleep very easily, and that particular morning, Cooper went silent immediately after buckling him in, even though moments earlier he was laughing, awake, and waving at staff in the Chick-fil-A restaurant. Ross's lawyers would say that since Cooper didn't make a peep, Ross just accidentally went to work instead of daycare, forgetting all about Cooper. After being fairly neutral with interrogators, it wasn't until Ross was reunited with Leanna that he finally broke down. He finally cried and he said sorry to her and was pretty upset. Leanna seemed to be comforting him, telling him how much she loved him, and again, she doesn't even cry with him. And Leanna's response came under scrutiny because she didn't seem to shed any tears for the loss of her son. She seemed more concerned with her husband, holding his hands and just listening to him sob. And some would say that she was being stoic and a good wife, but she would also be seen on camera saying something that confused a lot of people as well as detectives, which was, quote, "Did you say too much?" End quote.
Do I need to get you a lawyer?
Yeah. I said, it's not like I went to the grocery store. I said, oh, it's going to be fine. I'm just going to go in for 30 minutes.
Did you say too much?
That's all I did was told him, David, to that. And then they
And this was interpreted by a lot of people that Leanna may have known more, that perhaps this was all planned. And I don't know about that, but it definitely seems like an odd thing to say, paired with how relaxed Leanna was, and even at times how relaxed Ross was. It definitely could be portrayed as they planned this. And all within the first 10 minutes of them reuniting, they would also calmly agree that the bright side of this was that Cooper was in a happier place, playing with his trucks in heaven. And that was really eerie to me. Wouldn't a happier place be at home with his parents? And Ross would say that he was worried about Leanna, and unfazed, she replies, "Don't worry, baby, I'm gonna make it." Still not crying or upset by the fact that her only son is dead. And I know people seek comfort in their religion, but they seem to accept this tragedy rather quickly. And again, not something I can personally relate to. I would probably be inconsolable and probably angry at my husband, but that's just me. Ross also starts to complain to Leanna about his hot jail cell and how it's so uncomfortable. They also discuss insurance, and apparently there was 2 insurance policies on Cooper, one for $2,000 and a second one for $25,000. And watching the tapes just made me so uncomfortable. The lack of emotion and just the odd things that they were just calmly talking about. It looked like they were having a normal conversation over lunch, and it just seemed very strange. Ross also expressed to Leanna that she needed to help get him out of jail because he now wanted to become an advocate for people not to leave their kids in hot cars. It almost was like he was joining a new club saying, "This happens to a lot of people and now I'm one of them." Maybe they didn't realize that they were being recorded because just a lot of the things they talked about just seemed so strange and really cold, considering the huge loss they just experienced. Leanna was never charged with Cooper's death. She was cleared pretty early on, but some people would always wonder if maybe she knew something more. Leanna would say that she was in shock and doesn't even really know why she was so calm. She would say that when she finally got home, she collapsed on the curb and cried, and she didn't want to go inside the house because it would be quiet without her son. During the police investigation, they'd find on their home computer just 5 days before, there would be evidence that Ross watched a video 2 times showing the dangers of leaving animals in hot cars. It was a veterinarian who sat in a hot car explaining the dangers. And there was also a confirmed search for how to survive prison. And the police consultant who looked through the computer said that Ross also deleted his internet history shortly before the day Cooper died. It's not said why, so we don't really know what else they were looking at or researching. And Ross would tell the police that after watching the video, he thought to himself, "I would hate for that to happen to my son." And this was also a fear of Leanna's, so they just had the discussion of children being left in hot cars. It was also that time of year that public service announcements would be aired on TV as well. So this would be fairly fresh in their minds. And during the initial investigation, Ross had said that his relationship with Leanna was fantastic, and he would go on to say that they had a strong relationship. But that wasn't actually the case. They were struggling, and it was for some time. He was apparently having issues at home with his sex drive and was prescribed medication. Leanna and Ross would also be having small arguments over the fact that he wasn't spending enough time with the family. It seems like both of them were just unhappy, but trying to hold it together for Cooper. And it was later revealed that while at work, he looked at divorce checklists unbeknownst to Leanna. So while Ross was having trouble with his sex life at home and spending too much time away, a lot of Ross's time away was spent with other women. Sometimes with one of his many casual girlfriends, or sometimes even prostitutes. Ross also had been sending lewd messages and inappropriate photos to a 15-year-old girl. Ross was fully living a double life. And I do want to point out that during the trial, Leanna almost seemed to defend Ross. And I don't know if she was just being really stoic, but she would say, quote, "He ruined my life and I never want to see him again. I would be fine with that," end quote, to say that he was a loving husband and a really good dad, but he just must have been lost. And even when prosecution asked her if she thought he was living a double life, she said no. And if they asked her if maybe he wasn't the person she thought that she had married, she would say no. She felt that he was the same person, but was just doing some things she wasn't aware of. And that was really confusing to me because if I found out my husband was sleeping with multiple other women, I would absolutely think he wasn't the man I married. I would have a very hard time defending him as a husband when there was so much deceit and lies. That's not being a good husband. A former escort would testify that Ross was a customer of hers in May of 2014, and she was hired on 3 different occasions. He would meet her at a room at the Econo Lodge, and this escort specifically remembers Ross because he wasn't really her type. Her clients were usually men that wanted to do things that weren't basic. But Ross was pretty vanilla, is what she said. He was boring, not a lot of small talk. They just have regular sex and he'd leave. And that was just really different than what she was used to. Ross was also at Marietta Hotel just days before Cooper's death. And not with that escort that testified, but with a different one. Ross also had many girlfriends. One of his main side chicks was named Janie Meadows. And when Janie testified, she actually seemed really annoyed to be in court. I watched the trial online, but Janie was only 18 when they met online. They met on a dating app called Scout in 2013. And Ross told her that his marriage was falling apart, and Janie was also going through a bad breakup. So she felt that she met him at a good time of her life. And she said she considered Ross to be her best friend who talked to her almost every day. Ross had professed his love to her pretty early on, and she didn't originally know about Leanna and Cooper, but by the time Ross admitted to her that he was married, it was too late. She was already in love. And they also talked about being together someday and talked about their future. But he told her that if it wasn't for Cooper, he would have left Leanna a long time ago. Their relationship would eventually peter off in June, and it sort of seemed like there was mixed signals between them, but they were still sending messages and pictures. Janie was dating a new guy and starting to cut ties off with Ross. But on the 17th, the day before Cooper's death, Ross tried to reach out to her again, but she didn't respond. He then tried again the morning of the 18th, only a few hours before Cooper's death. But again, she didn't respond. Molly Sims was also someone who he met on a dating app. She was also 18 years old when she met Ross, and he admitted to Molly that he had a wife, but that didn't stop him from communicating with her. They too would text photos and send dirty texts for almost 2 years, and that overlapped with his relationship with Janie as well. She ended things when she found a boyfriend for herself. He also texted Alexandra Swindle just 3 days before Cooper died. When Alexandra met Ross in 2012, she was only 18 years old and a student in Alabama. He never mentioned that he was married or had a child. The first time they met, Ross would pick her up from the university and drove her to a park where they talked, kissed, and she performed oral sex on him. They didn't meet up again after that, but did continue a texting relationship for a few months before things fizzled out. But then just a few weeks before Cooper's death, they would start talking again. And the day Cooper died, she admitted that she wanted to see him one more time for sex, and he would respond with a dick pic. Then there was Elizabeth Smith, who also met him online. She was 21, and she met up with him in a parking lot off the interstate for sex. And they, too, never met again face-to-face after that. But a few months later, he would send a selfie of himself and Cooper at a Braves game. Elizabeth and Ross would talk just about every day, too, and I don't know how he kept track of them all. Their last few messages were 12:14 a.m. June 18th, 5:46 a.m., and they messaged each other by 7:25 a.m. Elizabeth had suggested that they meet up for oral sex and asked if she could meet him later because she was out of town. So the morning he was supposed to be dropping off Cooper, he was texting Elizabeth, Alexandra, and Janie. But there were others. Caitlin Hickey Floyd also testified that she had sexting conversations just weeks before Cooper died. And the day Cooper died, he was also speaking with an unnamed woman on an app called Whisper, talking about how he woke up at 5:30 a.m. with his son, also saying that Cooper was an awesome kid, and just 10 minutes before he left Cooper in the car, he would send a text saying, "I love my son, but we both need escapes." Friends and family didn't know about his second life. Ross kept that part of his life very secretive. He did tell his best friend, Billy Kirkpatrick, that he was struggling with pornography. And Billy worked with a ministry at his Alabama church that helped men with risky or extramarital behavior. He helped Ross install a program onto his computer that would flag questionable websites. And I don't know for sure if Leanna knew, but Billy had this to help Ross have accountability for his actions. And he actually noticed that Ross was going to sites like Adult Friendly Finder and Ashley Madison, but he didn't bring them up in fear of embarrassing Ross. I would assume that Ross probably carried a lot of stress and guilt with this secret, but he never tried to stop himself. In fact, I felt like it was just getting worse and worse. And the prosecution would use this against him, saying that he didn't want to be a married man anymore, and removing Cooper from the picture would allow him to live the life he wanted. Ross was found guilty of all charges brought against him and sentenced to serve life without parole. He was also found guilty of all charges related to the relationship he had with the 15-year-old girl since she was a minor. Ross has remained in prison, but he has demanded a new trial, and they're currently in the process of obtaining approval to do so. The defense says that Ross wasn't given a fair trial, even though the trial was moved to Brunswick in the Atlanta area to get more unbiased jury. That wasn't enough for them. They also feel that evidence was wrongly admitted. Also, the judge should have denied the unrelated offenses to occur during the trial for Cooper. So the charges of a minor he was communicating with separately than what Cooper's trial was. Basically, the defense thinks that those two should have been done separately with a separate jury because they feel the jury was swayed by the text messages and photos in relation to the minor, which they don't feel have anything to do with Cooper's death. In my opinion, bringing up the second life just shows the kind of person he was and how distracted he was and selfish he was. Even though it's all circumstantial, it does prove that he obviously wasn't happy with his life. And maybe the charges with the minor could have been separated, but the other messages and other things he was doing in his double life is fine to include. But I'm not a lawyer. They don't think it's fair. Leanna did speak to the media 2.5 years later, and she still believes that Ross did not do it on purpose. She stands by him and defends him, and she still says that he was a good father. Now, I'm not pointing fingers at daycares. It's not their fault that these things happen, and they're not to blame. But if daycares made a policy to follow up with parents right away when they notice kids are absent, that really would help. If everyone works together, maybe infant deaths would turn more into rescues. But with this case, something just really bothers me about it. It just doesn't feel like forgotten baby syndrome, and I don't really know he did it on purpose either. But in the end, nothing is going to bring back Cooper, and I hope justice was served here and the right people are in jail. And I would love to know what you guys think. Was this a case of forgotten baby syndrome, or was this something more? Let me know, leave a comment, and thanks again for joining me here at Felony Spectator.